Go score! Go score! Yay!
All right, guys, welcome back to my spare bedroom. This week, we're looking at chapter 38. But before we get into that, I'm going to touch on a couple things. One, good job getting the peer grade stuff in. We're going to do more of that work this week. Excuse me. Another big update, though, is next week on Wednesday, my wife and I are going to the hospital, and we're going to have she's going to have a C-section to give birth to my next son. So you're probably going to have to check in with somebody else on the old Zoom meeting. I'll have all your work up there, don't worry. We'll get you prepared for the AP exam. But this week we're looking at chapter 38. Let's talk about last week, what we finished with. Last week, right, we finished with Nixon getting elected in a landslide, right? This Republican resurgence. Realized that previous to that, minus Eisenhower, you had a big stretch of Democrats. And so now you're going to have Republicans. And Nixon was super popular, right? Nixon gets a bit of a bad rap because of Watergate, but Watergate was horrible. But he made the EPA, people liked him. There was a bit of economic problems during his presidency, but for the most part, until Watergate, he was seen as pretty successful. So, looking at the must-knows for the chapter in the book, the must-knows are always like really redundant. So yet again, this week it said you must know Vietnam. So Nixon is going to take us out of Vietnam with Vietnamization. He's going to up the bombing. As we know, that's not going to be super successful. Also, the concept of détente, right? The easing of hostilities between nations, right? So that they can come to some sort of agreement. And then lastly, Watergate, right? And the big thing about Watergate is that the president was using campaign funds to create the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, and he would use them as like goons to go around and harass his opponents. And famously, right, they broke into the Watergate Hotel, which had an office for the Democratic Committee or whatever, the Democratic Party, and he was trying to spy on them, plant bugs, all that sort of stuff. And they were caught. And eventually, right, the president lied about it all, even though he knew what was going on. And when they find out in hearings that there were tapes, they find out that he lied. You know, it wasn't a short thing. It happened over a long period of time. And if you go back and watch the video, there's a great CNN decade series called The 70s, and in it there's a great episode on Watergate, which we would have watched. But the people at the time were kind of up and down on it, like today when we talk about impeachment. But at the end, when it was obvious he was a crook, everybody was pro-impeachment. Now, what's going to happen is President Ford will come in and be the president. Now, he'll be the first president that is not elected, right? Because he was appointed vice president. Spiro Agnew had been kicked out of the office for, I want to say, embezzlement or something like that. And so they put Ford in, they appointed Ford as the vice president. The president picked another vice president. So when the president then he's not impeached, he resigns. Ford then becomes the president, and he will be the first non-elected person to be the president. Ford's going to be sort of ho-hum, and his economic policies are going to be a little bit, liberal. And so in turn, when it comes to the National Convention to elect another nominee for president, Ford barely wins out. There's a new up-and-comer from California named Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan will be the kind of shining light off in the distance that we'll see here in 4 years, because this will be the election in 1976. So what's going to happen is the American people are going to elect Jimmy Carter, and Jimmy Carter is the opposite of Nixon, right? Jimmy Carter's going to be like this humanitarian, kind of feel-good guy, but he comes off kind of as dopey, right? He's going to famously give the economic malaise speech, right? Because what was going on in the world at the time was you had inflation and you had an economy that was not matching inflation, so people felt like they didn't have enough money. The problems that we're going to see in Iran with the revolution are going to have OPEC trigger to limit the output of oil, and you're going to have another energy crisis. And through all of this, Carter makes the poor decision to give this speech. And it was not really like a pep talk. It was really like we got to buckle down and, do better kind of thing. And it felt like a lecture. And so the American people were really kind of turned off by it, right? And this did not help Carter going into the 1976 election. After the Malay speech up there, I got feminist. There's a big feminist movement through the 70s. You're going to get Title IX, which is like basically spending for men and women has to be the same in public institutions. So like famously, right, like in college athletics, right, if your football team spends $10 million, you got to spend $10 million on women's athletics. This is why in the SEC, for example, you always have really good track teams, women's track teams, really good women's basketball teams, that kind of stuff, because they spend money in those areas to offset the spending on male sports. Besides that, you're going to get an attempt at an equal rights amendment, but that will fail for several reasons. There's a good Last Week Tonight where John Oliver kind of breaks down this woman that was a campaigner against it. But the Equal Rights Amendment won't be a constitutional amendment. It'll fail. But you will get Roe v. Wade. And I know Roe v. Wade with the abortion aspect, especially in the light of the school, is bad. But the notion at the time, right, was that women having control of their bodies, right? That's the notion. And that's why it gets chunked in under the feminist movement. So, as I was saying here, in 1976, Reagan... We're going back to that. Sorry, I've got them in a list here. Reagan, right, in California is going to be the governor, and he's going to be super popular, and he's going to bring about some economic changes. He's going to cut taxes and do these sorts of things. It become a little bit of an economic miracle in California at the time. Also, California having a Republican governor, not always the case. But realize there's a big, strong Central Valley in California that is a big farming community that's strongly Republican. And Reagan will represent what we refer to as the New Right, right, or neoconservatism, right? And neoconservatism and the New Right are going to be pushing American American policy from 1980 all the way to 1994, when you see the election, or maybe 1992, I guess, the election of Bill Clinton, right? So you're going to have 2 terms of Reagan, 1 term of Bush Sr., and this is all that is going to be under the guise of the New Right, and eventually what Bush will call compassionate conservatism. When I talked about Jimmy Carter, yeah, I guess those are the must-knows for this week. Remember, next week you're going to have a slightly different Zoom experience. This week on Zoom, we're going to talk about writing a little bit, so it's not going to maybe be our normal, like, check in and go. We're going to talk about thesis writing. Your homework this week is pretty low. You got 2 presidents, Nixon and Ford, and Crash Course 41, and you got another peer grade assignment. I hope everybody's doing well, and I will catch you next time. Ziggy diggy doo, ziggy diggy doo, ziggy diggy.